So in exercise 6, we are given the following problem. The city of Malaise is considering a 10% tax on the revenues of all hotels and motels inside the city limits. Although not completely different from hotels and motels in the nearby suburbs, the ones in Malaise have a distinct advantage in their proximity to the interesting sites and convention centers. So individuals will pay some premium to stay in Malaise rather than to stay nearby. So to summarize this part of the exercise description, this is basically saying that there are not many good substitutes for hotels and motels inside the city. So consumers cannot deviate strongly to other hotels and motels which are not in the city limit. Okay, let us continue with the exercise description. Furthermore, all land is used equally well by hotels and motels and other forms of businesses. Any Malays land not taken by hotel motel is readily absorbed by other forms of businesses. The mayor of this city calls you to advise him on the incidence of such a tax. So he's particularly concerned with who will bear this tax in the short run, so considering several months, and the long one, so considering several years. Yeah, and in sub exercise A, we're asked what is the incidence of the tax in the short run. Answer intuitively and use a diagram to illustrate. So the question here is that which side of the market is more elastic in the short run and in the long run, and hence has to carry or bear the tax, most of the tax basically. And we will use the information which is given here in the exercise description to determine which side of the market is more elastic than the other side in the short and the long run. So let us start with sub exercise A. So the information that we get is that, using the information that we get, the answer is in the short run, the burden will probably be carried equally by the demand side and the supply side. So both sides are relatively inelastic. So why is that? So the demand side, so when we consider the demand side, the reason why the demand side is inelastic is because there are no good substitutes for hotels slash motels in, so it should be M, in the city center. So if the tax increases and hence prices become higher, so prices that the consumer have to pay, they cannot deviate to other hotels and motels in the nearby region, but they have to still remain in the city center. And this is the reason why they cannot deviate from those hotels and motels. And hence, this means that the demand side is quite inelastic. Yeah, so inelastic demand, and supply side. So in the short run, a motel or the owner, so in the short run, the owner owners of hotels, motels cannot change their business. So if you consider the short run, if you own a hotel, you cannot simply during 1 month or some months shut down the hotel and open, for instance, a restaurant or a grocery store or something like this. And therefore, the consequence is that we also have inelastic supply. Okay, so we have inelastic supply, which means that also the supply is not reacting strongly to changes in the price, which is then or changes with respect to a tax increase, because yeah, the supply side cannot react strongly. And we can draw a little picture to see what, like how the things are looking like graphically. So we have a coordinate system here, and we have rooms per night on the x-axis, so rooms per night, and we have prices or room price on the y-axis. And then what we have is that we first have an inelastic demand. So let me just draw the line here. So an inelastic demand means that the rooms per night which are demanded are not changing strongly if the room price is increasing. So the steeper the demand function, the less, if you have a change in the prices, the quantity of the quantity which is demanded is changing. Yeah, because yeah, if you consider a change of prices which is going from, yeah, let's say from here to here. Okay, so from, you're changing the prices of a room from this point to this point here. You see that the changes in quantities are less. Yeah, so this would be the change for this demand function here. Then here, if you consider the first demand function that I draw, the difference here would be larger. Yeah, so the steeper the demand curve is, the less inelastic so the more inelastic it is, and hence the less it can react to changes in prices. Yeah, so this is the idea. Yeah, so let me erase all of this. Yeah, let me just redo almost everything here. Okay, so we have a relatively inelastic demand, which is somehow looking like this. Then we have a supply, which is also inelastic, so it's also quite steep, which is looking like this here. And this would be here the equilibrium rooms per night. And this would be the equilibrium price here, which we have. And then if you have a change in taxes, which then, yeah, it was a tax on, let me just recheck this. So it was a tax on the revenue of the hotels. So it decreases the profits of the suppliers, of the hotel owners, which means that we will have a shift of the supply curve. So let me just denote this by old supply. This is the demand. If we have this tax of 10%, it will shift the supply curve to the left. So we'll end up somewhere here. And basically what will happen here is that we have a new kind of quantity, which is then, so no new equilibrium quantity, which is there. And what we will have is basically that um, the demand side and the supply side are sharing the burden of this new tax. But as you can see here, if we have steep um, demand and supply curves, what happens is basically that even if we increase the taxes, so this is the new supply here on the left hand side, even if we increase taxes and supply goes to the left, if we have a steep supply, there won't be, so a relatively inelastic supply, there won't be any strong changes with respect to the actual rooms which are demanded in equilibrium and supplied in equilibrium. Yeah, so the graphic here should just show you that if you have steep supply and demand, the changes in the quantity are not as high as a situation where it would be flat. And this is what we will be seeing in sub-exercise B, because in sub-exercise B, we are asked about what the long-run incidence is. And in the long run, what happens is that the supply side, so in the long run, supply side becomes more elastic. And why is that? The reason is because owners can change their business. So they can, for instance, switch from they can switch from a hotel or a motel to a restaurant, and then deviate from this tax increase on hotels and motels. And as a consequence, the supply side becomes more elastic because the owners have more opportunities to deviate compared to a situation in the short run. So um, they can change their business, and hence tax burden is carried more by the demand side in the long run. So in the long run, yeah, things change. It's not equally carried anymore by both the suppliers and the consumers or demand side, but now it's carried more by the supply side. And we can also see this if we draw it graphically. Let me just again put something here. So how does a more elastic demand curve look like? So let's draw the demand curve as before. So again, on the y-axis, you have the prices. On the x-axis, you have the demand, so the rooms per night. This here is the demand curve. And if you now have a more steep, more flat supply curve, something like this. So this is the supply. Then what you basically get is that more of the tax burden is carried by the demand side, which is here. If you have a tax increase, yeah, so then you write down something like this here. So this is the supply without taxes. So let me just write this next to this thing here. So this is supply without taxes, and up here is the supply with taxes. And what you can get there is that if you have a change in supply which reacts stronger than the demand side, also the demand side, so in this situation where we have a long run perspective, the demand side will carry more of the tax burden. Yeah, so since the supply side is more elastic. Okay, this brings us to sub-exercise C. In sub-exercise C, we are asked, how would your analysis in part B change if hotels and motels in the suburbs were perfect substitutes for those in Malaysia? And what would happen to tax revenues? So what would change is that demand side becomes more elastic. Well, the reason is simply because the hotels and motels in the suburbs, which are not in the city center, are now perfect substitutes for those in Malaysia, which means that if the prices of for staying in hotels and motels in the city center is increasing, then the demand, so the consumers can easily substitute those hotels and motels with other hotels, motels in the suburbs. Yeah, so as a consequence, the demand side becomes more elastic, and the elasticity or the increased elasticity has two effects. So first, the suppliers, or the burden of the tax is carried by the supply side again, or carried more, or not more, but carried equally by the supply side again, as it was the case in the short run perspective. So in the long term, we argued that hotel owners and motel owners can change their business, so they can open up a restaurant instead of a hotel motel, so they can change it. Therefore, the supply is more elastic in the long term. But now, if the demand side can substitute with hotels and motels in the suburbs, also the supply side, the demand side becomes more elastic, and hence the burden of the tax is carried equally by the supply side again. Yeah, so there is no benefit that the supply side has relative to the demand side. The second effect is that the number of rented rooms would fall. So the revenue, the consequence of this is that the revenue of the tax would decline. Okay, so since now both demand and supply are more elastic, so they can deviate to other businesses or to other hotels and motels, which are not in the city center, the number of rented rooms in the city center would fall because of the elasticity, and hence, since the tax is only on rooms in the city center, the revenue of the tax would decline. Yeah. So basically, the two effects are, first of all, that the burden of tax, the tax changes, in that now again it's more equally distributed on the supply and the demand side. And the second effect, when the demand side becomes more elastic, is that the number of rented rooms would fall, and hence the revenue would basically decline. Yeah, and this is kind of a bad situation because, yeah, the government probably needs tax revenue in order to build streets or something like this, or to redistribute it. And hence, it's a bad effect if the tax revenue decreases because you increase the taxes too much. And this finishes this problem set. So if you have any questions, please let me know via mail. And otherwise, see you next week.